Picture a grand English manor, candlelight glinting off a priceless stamp, the blue Mauritius, locked in a glass case. At a gathering of collectors, it vanishes without a trace, right under their noses. Suspicion falls on the proud host, a cunning dealer, a charming widow, and a bitter rival. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and village wisdom, can unravel the web of greed and deception. In a tale of hidden motives and clever clues, one question burns. Who dared to steal a fortune in a single night? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Thornfield Manor. The late summer sun cast long shadows over the rolling lawns of Thornfield Manor. A sprawling Georgian pile nestled in the heart of St. Mary Mead's countryside. Its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows exuded an air of timeless dignity. But tonight, an electric undercurrent of excitement pulsed through its halls. Colonel Archibald Rutherford, a widower of some 60 years and a philatelist of no small renown, had invited a select company to view his latest acquisition, the Blue Mauritius, a stamp so rare that its name alone could hush a room of collectors. In the village, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea at Mrs. Bantry's, the event was spoken of in reverent whispers. Miss Jane Marple, who had known the Colonel since his days as a young officer, had accepted his invitation with her usual quiet curiosity. She sat now in the Manor's drawing-room, a slight figure in a black lace dress, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm as steady as a metronome. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, roamed over the assembled guests, noting each gesture, each glance, with the precision of a naturalist studying rare birds. Colonel Rutherford stood by the fireplace, his military bearing undiminished by age. His white moustache quivered as he recounted, for the third time, the tale of acquiring the Blue Mauritius at a private auction in London. A fierce bidding war, I assure you, he boomed, his voice carrying the cadence of a man accustomed to command. But I knew its worth, priceless, in the right hands. The stamp itself rested in a glass case on a rosewood table, its deep indigo hue catching the flicker of the chandelier above. The case, locked with a mechanism the Colonel swore was impregnable, was the evening's centrepiece. Beside him, Mr. Percival Sloane, a stamp dealer from London, leaned forward in his chair. His thin lips curled in a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His suit, impeccably tailored, spoke of success, but his fingers, stained faintly with ink, betrayed a man who worked closely with his wares. "A remarkable specimen," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "One of only 12 known to exist. Its provenance is impeccable." Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on the stamp, not with admiration, but with something sharper. Calculation, perhaps. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a widow of uncertain age, sat across from Sloane, her silk gown rustling as she adjusted her fan. Her beauty was striking, with dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, and eyes that sparkled with a practised charm. She claimed to be a casual enthusiast, invited at the Colonel's insistence after meeting him at a charity gala. "I confess I know little of stamps," she said with a laugh like crystal, "but this one is quite the talk of the town." Miss Marple, who had seen many a performance in the village hall, sensed a studied artifice in her manner. The final guest, Mr. Victor Drake, lounged in an armchair near the window, his lean frame coiled with restless energy. A rival collector, his reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. His dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, flicked between the stamp and the Colonel, and his smile carried a hint of mockery. "You've outdone yourself, Rutherford. he said, his tone just shy of insolent. "But keeping such a treasure under glass, doesn't it beg to be stolen?" The room tensed at his words, and the Colonel's face reddened, but Drake only laughed, raising his glass of sherry. The evening progressed with dinner, a sumptuous affair of roast pheasant and claret served in the Manor's dining room. Conversation turned to philately, with the Colonel expounding on the history of the Mauritius post office stamps. Miss Marple, content to listen, let her thoughts wander to the village, where a stolen necklace had once caused a similar stir. People, she reflected, were predictable in their desires, whether for jewels or stamps. As the clock struck 10, the guests returned to the drawing-room for coffee. The Colonel, with a flourish, approached the glass case to offer a closer view of the blue Mauritius. His hand reached for the key, which he kept on a chain in his waistcoat pocket. But as he lifted the glass, a gasp escaped him. The velvet cushion within was bare. The stamp was gone. "Good heavens!" the Colonel cried, his voice cracking. "It's impossible!" The guests crowded around, their faces a tableau of shock and suspicion. Sloane's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Vance clutched her pearls, and Drake's lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, surveyed the scene. The lock was untouched, the windows latched, and the door had been under the butler's watchful eye all evening. Yet the stamp had vanished, as if spirited away by some unseen hand. "Someone in this room," the Colonel said, his voice trembling with fury, "is a thief." Miss Marple said nothing, but her needles resumed their gentle clicking, a quiet counterpoint to the rising tension. In her mind, a thread had begun to form, one she would follow, as she always did, to the heart of the matter. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, so recently a stage for genteel conversation, and the glow of candlelight, had transformed into a tableau of shock and suspicion. The empty glass case, its velvet cushion starkly bare, stood as a mute accusation at the room's centre. Colonel Archibald Rutherford, his face flushed with a mixture of indignation and disbelief, paced before the fireplace, his heavy steps muffled by the Persian rug. The blue Mauritius, the jewel of his collection, had vanished, and the air was thick with unspoken questions. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a high-backed chair, her knitting resting in her lap, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her pale blue eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, missed nothing, not the tremble in the Colonel's hand, nor the fleeting glances exchanged among the guests. The room was still, save for the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the Manor's ancient timbers. The assembled company, Mr. Percival Sloane, the stamp dealer, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the charming widow, and Mr. Victor Drake, the rival collector, stood or sat in various attitudes of dismay. The butler, Mr. Hargreaves, a stooped figure with a face like weathered oak, hovered near the door, his usual impassivity shaken. It was he who had first raised the alarm, his sharp cry of "Sir, the stamp!" cutting through the post-dinner chatter like a blade. "Impossible!" Colonel Rutherford repeated, his voice hoarse. "The case was locked, the key in my pocket all evening. No one could have touched it." He brandished the small brass key, its chain glinting in the firelight, as if its presence could refute the theft. "I checked the case myself at 9 o'clock, just before we returned from dinner. It was there, I swear it." Miss Marple's needles, which had paused at the Colonel's outburst, resumed their gentle rhythm. She noted the Colonel's words, his insistence on the key's security, and filed them away. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a case where a locked box had been no barrier to a determined thief. The trick, she mused, was often in what was overlooked. Inspector Crawley, summoned from the village police station, arrived with the promptness of a man accustomed to late-night calls. He was a stout, ruddy-faced officer, his moustache bristling with authority, though Miss Marple suspected his experience leaned more toward poachers and petty vandals than high-stakes thefts. He stood now by the glass case, notebook in hand, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced air of command. "Right then," he said, his voice carrying the no-nonsense tone of the local constabulary. "Let's have the facts. Colonel, you say the stamp was in the case at 9. When did you notice it missing?" "Just past 10, the Colonel replied, his hands clasped behind his back as if addressing a regiment. "We'd finished dinner, returned here for coffee. I thought to show the stamp again, give the guests a closer look. That's when I opened the case and found it gone." Inspector Crawley nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "And the case was locked. No signs of tampering." "None," the Colonel said firmly. "The lock is a custom design made by a London firm. It's unpickable, or so I was told. The key never left my possession." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the case. Its glass was pristine, the brass lock gleaming without a scratch. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Might I ask, Colonel, if anyone approached the case during the evening, before dinner perhaps?" The Colonel frowned, his moustache twitching. "No one, Miss Marple. I kept an eye on it myself. We were all together. Drinks at 7, dinner at 8, then back here. Hargreaves was at the door the whole time." The butler, hearing his name, stepped forward. "That's correct, sir," he said, his voice low but steady. "I was stationed by the door from 6 o'clock onward. No one entered or left without my seeing them." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was already turning. A locked case, a guarded door, and a room full of witnesses. Yet the stamp was gone. It was, she thought, rather like the case of Mrs. Eldridge's missing brooch, stolen from a locked drawer during a village fete. The solution had lain in what no one thought to question. Inspector Crawley turned to the guests, his pencil poised. "I'll need statements from each of you. Mr. Sloane, let's start with you. Where were you between 9 and 10? Percival Sloane, seated near the window, uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. His face, usually composed, betrayed a flicker of unease. "I was here, Inspector, the entire time. After dinner, I sat with Mrs. Vance, discussing the history of the Mauritius stamps. I never went near the case." Mrs. Vance, perched on a velvet settee, nodded in agreement. "Quite right, Mr. Sloane. We were chatting about the penny black as well, weren't we? Such a fascinating subject." Her smile was radiant, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted her fan. Mrs. Vance's gown, a deep emerald silk, shimmered in the firelight, and her eyes darted toward the empty case with a curiosity that seemed more than casual. "And you, Mrs. Vance?" the inspector asked. "Can you confirm your movements?" "Oh, certainly," she replied, her voice light but precise. "I was with Mr. Sloane until perhaps 10 minutes to 10, when I stepped out to the terrace for some air. The room was rather warm, you see. I returned just as the Colonel discovered the theft." "Alone on the terrace?" Inspector Crawley's tone was neutral, but his eyes narrowed. "Yes, alone," Mrs. Vance said, her smile unwavering. "I find the garden so peaceful at night. Miss Marple's needles paused again. The terrace, she recalled, was accessible through the French doors, which stood only a few feet from the glass case. She made a mental note to inspect the doors later, though she suspected they, too, would show no signs of forced entry. The inspector turned to Victor Drake, who had remained silent, his lean frame slouched against the wall. His dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of amusement and defiance. "And you, Mr. Drake? Where were you?" Drake straightened, his lips curling into a half-smile. "Right here, Inspector, enjoying the Colonel's excellent claret. I was talking with our host about his collection. Quite a spirited discussion, wasn't it, Rutherford?" He glanced at the Colonel, who grunted in acknowledgement. "I didn't go near the case, if that's what you're asking, though I must say, it's a bold thief who'd steal under so many noses." The inspector scribbled again, his expression unreadable. "Anyone see anything unusual? Any strangers in the house? Any odd behaviour?" The room was silent. Hargreaves shook his head, and the guests exchanged glances, each seeming to weigh their words. Miss Marple, however, was watching Sloane. His fingers, still ink-stained, twitched slightly, and his eyes flicked toward the door, as if measuring the distance to freedom. She wondered what a stamp dealer might do with a prize like the Blue Mauritius. Sell it, perhaps, to a collector who asked no questions. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a grocer who fenced stolen goods through a similar pretense of respectability. "Very well," Inspector Crawley said, snapping his notebook shut. "I'll need to examine the room and the case. No one leaves the manor until I've had a proper look. Colonel, may I use your study for interviews?" "Of course," the Colonel said, though his voice was strained. "Hargreaves, show the inspector to the study." As the butler led Crawley away, the guests dispersed, their murmurs filling the room with a low hum of tension. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting untouched now, her mind sifting through the evening's events. She rose slowly, her small figure moving toward the glass case with the air of someone merely curious. The lock, as the Colonel had said, was pristine, its brass surface unmarred by scratches or dents. The glass itself was flawless, reflecting the firelight in sharp, clear lines. She bent closer, her eyes narrowing as she noticed a faint smudge on the glass, barely visible, a trace of wax perhaps or oil. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned to trust small things. She straightened and glanced at the French doors leading to the terrace. They were latched, their bolts secure, but she noted the ease with which they could be opened from within. A quick step, a moment's distraction, and someone could have slipped out, or in. She made a mental note to ask Hargreaves about the terrace, though she suspected his vigilance, like the Colonel's, had its limits. The Colonel approached, his face still flushed. "Miss Marple, you've a sharp mind. What do you make of this business?" "Oh, I'm just an old woman, Colonel," she said, her voice mild. "But it does remind me of a theft in St. Mary Mead. A silver teapot, taken from a locked cabinet. The thief was someone no one suspected, you see, because they were so very careful to seem above suspicion." The Colonel frowned, clearly puzzled, but Miss Marple only smiled. She returned to her chair, picking up her knitting as the guests resumed their uneasy conversations. Sloane was now speaking in low tones to Mrs. Vance, his gestures animated but controlled. Mrs. Vance nodded, her fan fluttering like a nervous bird. Drake, meanwhile, had retreated to the window, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Each, Miss Marple thought, had their own reasons to covet the Blue Mauritius, or to wish it gone. She considered the possibilities. Sloane, with his knowledge of stamps and access to buyers, could have seen the theft as a path to profit. Mrs. Vance, with her vague alibi and air of hidden motives, might have debts or ambitions that a stolen stamp could satisfy. Drake, driven by rivalry, could have taken it to spite the Colonel, or perhaps to complete his own collection. And the Colonel himself, well, Miss Marple had known men who staged thefts for insurance or sympathy, though the Colonel's distress seemed genuine. As the fire burned low, Hargreaves returned, announcing that the inspector was ready to begin interviews. The guests filed out, their footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged hall. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the empty case. The theft, she knew, was not a matter of brute force, but of cunning, a sleight of hand, a moment of distraction. She thought of the wax smudge, the locked case, the guarded door. Somewhere in those details lay the truth, as it always did. She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, her mind already weaving a pattern from the threads of the evening. The blue Mauritius was gone, but Miss Marple was certain it had not gone far. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that secrets, like stamps, were rarely lost. They were simply hidden, waiting for a keen eye to find them. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Pride. The morning after the theft of the blue Mauritius dawned crisp and golden, the late summer light filtering through the heavy drapes of Thornfield Manor's morning room. Miss Jane Marple sat opposite Colonel Archibald Rutherford at a small, polished table, a delicate porcelain teacup cradled in her hands. The Colonel, still shaken from the previous night's calamity, had invited her to join him for tea, a gesture she accepted with her usual quiet grace. The room was warm, its oak-panelled walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow the conversation. A silver tray bore scones and a pot of Darjeeling, its aroma mingling with the faint scent of beeswax polish. Miss Marple's knitting lay folded in her lap, a silent companion as she listened, her mind as sharp as the needles she wielded. Colonel Rutherford, his military bearing softened by fatigue, poured the tea with a precision that spoke of years of discipline. His white moustache bristled as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I simply cannot fathom it, Miss Marple," he said, setting the teapot down with a clink. "The blue Mauritius, gone! A stamp of such rarity, such historical weight. I won it at Sotheby's last spring, you know, after a bidding war that nearly turned to fisticuffs." His eyes gleamed with the memory, pride undimmed by the theft. "It's not just the value, though. That's considerable. It's the prestige, the triumph of owning something so few can claim." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, though her thoughts were already threading through the maze of the previous evening. She had known men like the Colonel in St. Mary Mead, men whose pride in their possessions was as much a part of them as their own heartbeat. She recalled old Mr. Hargreaves, not the butler, but a village shopkeeper, who had boasted of his rare porcelain vase until it was stolen during a church bazaar. Pride, she had learned, could blind even the most vigilant to the faults of those they trusted. "You take great care with your collection, Colonel," she said, her voice soft but probing. "I imagine you have many safeguards in place." "Safeguards?" The Colonel's hand slapped the table, rattling the teacups. "The case is a masterpiece of engineering, Miss Marple. crafted by Lockhart and Sons, finest locksmiths in London. The key, he patted his waistcoat pocket, where the chain still hung, never leaves me. I check the case hourly when it's on display. A habit from my army days. Routine, you see, keeps a man sharp. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the pocket where the key resided. And you checked it last night, you said? At 9 o'clock? Precisely, he replied, leaning back in his chair. It was there, gleaming like a sapphire. I locked the case myself, turned the key twice to be sure. No one could have touched it without my knowledge. Yet someone did, Miss Marple said gently, her tone carrying no hint of accusation. It's curious, isn't it? A locked case, a guarded room, and still the stamp vanishes. It reminds me of a theft in St. Mary Mead, a silver locket taken from a locked box during a village fete. The owner was certain his precautions were foolproof, but precautions, you see, can sometimes be turned against us. The Colonel frowned, his moustache twitching. What do you mean, Miss Marple? Oh, nothing specific, she said, her smile disarming. Only that those who know us best often know our habits too. A clever thief might use that familiarity to their advantage. The Colonel's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, reaching instead for a scone. Miss Marple watched him, noting the faint tremor in his hand. Not fear, she thought, but anger. The kind that comes when a man's sense of control is shattered. She sipped her tea, her mind turning to the key. If it had truly never left the Colonel's possession, then the thief had either bypassed the lock or found a way to use the key itself. The smudge of wax she had noticed on the glass case lingered in her thoughts. A small detail, but one that suggested a method more subtle than brute force. The conversation turned to the stamp's history, and the Colonel's voice warmed with enthusiasm. The blue Mauritius, Miss Marple, is no mere piece of paper. It's a relic of 1847, printed in error on blue paper by the Mauritius Post Office. Only 12 are known to exist, each a testament to human fallibility and fortune. I outbid a Dutchman and an American at that auction, men with deeper pockets but less determination. It's the crown of my collection, a symbol of what a man can achieve with focus. Miss Marple listened, her needles still in her lap, though she longed to pick them up, to let their rhythm steady her thoughts. The Colonel's pride was not just in the stamp, but in the act of possessing it, of displaying it to others. She wondered if that pride had made him careless, trusting his guests too readily. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how pride could blind a man to betrayal, as when Mrs. Carter's prized rose bushes were poisoned by a jealous neighbour she had invited to tea. "Tell me, Colonel," Miss Marple said, setting her teacup down, "your guests last night, Mr. Sloane, Mrs. Vance, Mr. Drake. You chose them carefully, I presume." "Of course," he said, his tone firm. "Sloane's the best dealer in London, knows the market like his own pulse. Mrs. Vance, a delightful woman, met her at a charity gala, has a keen interest in rare artifacts, though she's no expert. And Drake, well, he's a rival, but a man of standing. I've known him for years, though we've crossed swords at auctions more than once. I vetted them all, Miss Marple. No riffraff in my home." "Indeed," she said, her voice as mild as the tea. "And yet, one of them may have betrayed your trust. Or perhaps someone else slipped in unnoticed." The Colonel shook his head. "Impossible. Hargreaves was at the door, and the staff know their duties. The manor's secure as a fortress." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. A fortress, yes. But even fortresses have their weak points. A servant, perhaps, or a moment when attention wandered. The Colonel bristled. His pride stung. My staff are loyal, Miss Marple. Hargreaves has been with me 20 years. The maids, the footmen, all hand-picked. I'd stake my reputation on them. And yet, she said softly, the stamp is gone. The Colonel fell silent, his gaze fixed on the window, where the garden stretched toward the horizon. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting the orderly rows of roses, the clipped hedges, a reflection of the Colonel's need for control. She thought of the terrace, where Mrs. Vance claimed to have wandered during the critical hour. The French doors, so close to the case, could be opened and closed in seconds. But Hargreaves had sworn no one passed through the door, and the windows were latched. The puzzle was tantalizing, its pieces scattered like the leaves outside. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for the tea, Colonel. It's been most illuminating. I think I'll take a turn about the gardens, if I may. The air might clear my thoughts. The Colonel nodded, still distracted. Of course, Miss Marple. I'll have Hargreaves show you out. As she stepped into the hall, Miss Marple paused by the drawing-room door, her eyes drawn once more to the glass case. It stood empty, a silent rebuke to the Colonel's confidence. She thought of the wax smudge, the keys chain, the routines so proudly described. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the most secure systems were often undone by their own predictability. Someone, she was certain, had known the Colonel's habits well enough to exploit them. The question was who and how. She stepped into the gardens, the gravel crunching under her sensible shoes. The air was cool, the scent of roses heavy. As she walked, her mind wove through the possibilities. Sloane's expertise, Vance's vagueness, Drake's ambition. Each had a motive, each a moment unaccounted for. The blue Mauritius, she knew, was not lost. It was hidden, waiting for her to find it. And find it she would, with the patience of a woman who had unravelled many a village secret. Chapter 4. The Dealer's Game. The library of Thornfield Manor was a haven of quiet, its high shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and the faint musty scent of old paper. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden patches on the polished floor, where Miss Jane Marple stood, her small figure almost lost amid the grandeur. She had wandered in after her garden stroll, drawn by the promise of solitude and the chance to observe Mr. Percival Sloane, the stamp dealer, who sat at a mahogany desk, engrossed in a thick catalogue of philatelic rarities. His fountain pen scratched softly, annotating margins with a precision that spoke of long habit. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, approached with the air of an elderly aunt seeking a pleasant chat, though her eyes were as keen as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Sloane," she said, her voice gentle but clear, settling into a chair opposite him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I find libraries so soothing, don't you?" Sloane looked up, his thin face breaking into a practised smile, though it faltered at the edges. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," he said, closing the catalogue with a snap. "You're quite right about libraries, a refugee for the mind. I was just reviewing some notes, keeping the brain sharp, you know." His fingers, still bearing faint ink stains, rested on the desk, and Miss Marple noted their slight tremble, as if he were conscious of her scrutiny. She smiled, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "You must have a vast knowledge of stamps, Mr. Sloane. The Colonel speaks so highly of you." "I confess I know little of philately, but the blue Mauritius sounds quite extraordinary. Such a pity it's gone missing." Sloane's smile tightened, his eyes flicking to the catalogue before returning to her. "A tragedy, indeed," he said. "A stamp like that, unique, irreplaceable. Its loss is a blow to the philatelic world." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest hitch, a note of unease that reminded her of Mr. Tompkins, the St. Mary Mead chemist who had once tried to explain away a missing bottle of laudanum with similar polish. "I imagine it would fetch a high price," she said, her tone artlessly curious. "The Colonel mentioned a fortune. Do such stamps often change hands discreetly, Mr. Sloane? Through private channels, perhaps?" Sloane's fingers twitched, and he leaned back, crossing his arms as if to shield himself. "Oh, occasionally," he said, his tone light but guarded. "The market for rarities is complex. Private collectors, discreet auctions, it's not uncommon. But the blue Mauritius? Too distinctive to sell easily. Only a fool would try to move it now." He laughed, a short, forced sound, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his for a moment longer than necessary. She thought of the smudge of wax on the glass case, the unmarred lock, and the Colonel's unyielding trust in his key. Sloane, with his expertise, would know the intricacies of such a lock, perhaps even how to bypass it. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a watchmaker who could open any safe with a hairpin and a steady hand. Sloane's ink-stained fingers suggested a man who worked with precision, perhaps even with tools small enough to manipulate a lock, or to make an impression of a key. "You were with Mrs. Vance last night, I believe," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "Discussing stamps," the inspector said. "She seems quite charming, though not terribly knowledgeable about philately." Sloane nodded, his composure returning. "Yes, Mrs. Vance is delightful company. She's more interested in the stories behind the stamps than their technicalities. We spoke of the penny black, its place in history. She was quite captivated." His smile was back, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. "History is so fascinating," she agreed. "Like the history of this manor, perhaps. You've visited before, I understand. You must know it well." Sloane's expression flickered, a shadow of caution crossing his face. "A few times, yes. The Colonel's collection is a draw for any dealer. I've advised him on acquisitions, cataloguing. He's meticulous, but he trusts my judgment." He paused, then added, "I was nowhere near the case last night, if that's what you're wondering." "Oh, I'm not wondering anything specific," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I'm just an old woman, Mr. Sloane, piecing things together as I chatter. It's curious, though, how a thief could act so swiftly in a crowded room. It reminds me of a theft in St. Mary Mead. A silver spoon, taken from a tea tray during a parish meeting. The thief was someone everyone trusted, you see, because he was so very good at seeming trustworthy." Sloane's laugh was brittle. "A charming story, Miss Marple, but I assure you, I'm no thief. I deal in stamps, not steal them." He rose, tucking the catalogue under his arm. "If you'll excuse me, I have some correspondence to attend to. The inspector's interviews, you know." "Of course," she said, her needles clicking steadily. "Don't let me keep you." As Sloane left, his footsteps quick on the parquet floor, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the desk. A scrap of paper, overlooked in his haste, lay half-hidden beneath a blotter. She reached for it, her movements slow but deliberate, and unfolded it. It was a list, written in Sloane's neat hand. "Blue Mauritius established. £200,000. Red Mercury, £150,000. Inverted Jenny, £180,000. The figures were staggering, but what caught her attention was the faint pencil mark beside the blue Mauritius, a small circled S. She tucked the paper into her knitting bag, her mind racing. The list suggested Sloane had been appraising the stamp's value, perhaps for a buyer. The black market, he had said, was a fool's game, but Miss Marple knew that fools were often clever in their own way. In St. Mary Mead, a poacher had once sold stolen pheasants through a network of discreet buyers, his charm masking his guilt. Sloane's polished manner, his nervous glances, his ink-stained hands, all pointed to a man with something to hide. She rose and approached the window, looking out at the gardens where Mrs. Vance had claimed to wander. The terrace was visible, its stone balustrade gleaming in the sunlight. Miss Marple thought of the French doors, so close to the glass case, and the ease with which a practised hand could slip through them. Sloane had been in the room, he said, but his conversation with Mrs. Vance might have been a distraction, a way to draw eyes away from the case. Or perhaps Mrs. Vance herself was complicit, her charm a cover for collusion. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Sloane's expertise made him the likeliest to have breached the case, but his motive was unclear. Greed, she knew, was a powerful force, but so was fear, of exposure, of ruin. She thought of the wax smudge, the keys chain, the crowded room. Someone had acted with audacity, trusting that suspicion would scatter like dust. Sloane's catalogue, his list, his unease, all were threads in the pattern she was weaving. As she left the library, the Manor's clock chimed noon, its notes echoing through the silent halls. Miss Marple paused, her eyes on the drawing-room door, where the empty case waited. The blue Mauritius was out there, she was certain, hidden by a hand as cunning as it was bold. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the truth often lay in the smallest details. A scrap of paper, a nervous glance, a stain of ink. She would watch Mr. Sloane and the others until the pattern was complete. Chapter 5. The Guest's Charm. The gardens of Thornfield Manor were a symphony of late summer blooms, their colours vivid against the manicured lawns and gravel paths. Miss Jane Marple, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, walked arm in arm with Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the widow whose elegance had drawn every eye at the previous night's gathering. The invitation for a stroll had been Mrs. Vance's, delivered with a smile that promised pleasant company, but Miss Marple's acceptance was driven by a quiet curiosity. Her sensible shoes crunched softly on the gravel, and her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar weight as she observed her companion. Mrs. Vance's emerald silk dress, now replaced by a tailored walking suit, moved with a grace that seemed almost theatrical, and her dark eyes sparkled with a warmth that Miss Marple found just a shade too deliberate. "What a dreadful business about the stamp," Mrs. Vance said, her voice light but tinged with concern as they paused by a bed of roses. "Poor Colonel Rutherford. He must be heartbroken. I confess, I feel quite out of my depth among all these collectors." She laughed, a sound like the chime of a silver bell, and fanned herself with a delicate lace handkerchief, though the morning air was cool. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, I'm sure you're not as out of place as you say, Mrs. Vance. You have a way of fitting in anywhere, I imagine. The Colonel mentioned you met at a charity gala. Such an interesting way to come by an invitation to Thornfield. Mrs. Vance's fan paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed its flutter. "Yes, quite a stroke of luck," she said, her tone as smooth as the petals under her fingers. "My late husband, Charles, was fond of rare things. Books, coins, that sort of thing. I suppose I inherited his curiosity, though I'm no expert. The Colonel was kind enough to invite me after we chatted about his collection. He's such a generous host." "Indeed he is," Miss Marple said, her voice mild as she bent to examine a rose, though her attention was fixed on Mrs. Vance. The widow's story was polished, each word chosen with care, but Miss Marple had heard similar tales in St. Mary Mead. Tales that unravelled under gentle scrutiny. Like the time Mrs. Price, the vicar's cousin, spun a story about a lost brooch to cover her gambling debts. "And your husband's interest in stamps, did he collect them himself?" Mrs. Vance's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she recovered. "Oh, not stamps specifically," she said, waving her hand airily. "He preferred manuscripts, first editions mostly. But he always said a collector's passion is universal, whether it's books or stamps or paintings. Don't you agree, Miss Marple?" "Quite," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, settling onto a stone bench beneath a trellis. "Though passion can lead to all sorts of behaviour, can't it? I remember a case in St. Mary Mead, a stolen cameo, taken by a woman who seemed the soul of charm. She was in debt, you see, and thought no one would suspect her because she was so very likeable." Mrs. Vance's laugh was a touch too bright. "What a story! But I assure you, Miss Marple, I'm not in debt. Charles left me quite comfortable, though I do miss the excitement of his world." She sat beside Miss Marple, her posture perfect, and turned the conversation to the gardens. "These roses are divine, aren't they? I was out here last night, you know, during that dreadful hour when the stamp went missing. The air was so refreshing after the stuffiness of the drawing-room." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting Mrs. Vance's with a look of innocent curiosity. "Yes, you mentioned the terrace. It must be lovely at night. Were you alone for long?" "Oh, perhaps 10 minutes, Mrs. Vance said, her fan moving faster now. "I needed a moment to clear my head. All that talk of stamps can be overwhelming for a novice like me." She smiled, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips, the way her fingers twisted the lace of her handkerchief. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned to trust small things, like the time she noticed a villager's nervous tic when questioned about a missing silver tray. The terrace, Miss Marple recalled, was mere steps from the French doors, which opened directly onto the drawing-room. Mrs. Vance's alibi was convenient, too convenient perhaps. No one had confirmed her presence outside, and the butler, Hargreaves, had been stationed at the main door, not the terrace. Miss Marple thought of the wax smudge on the glass case, the unmarred lock, and the Colonel's key so proudly guarded. Could a woman as poised as Mrs. Vance have slipped through the French doors, distracted the room with her charm, and made off with the stamp? It seemed unlikely, yet not impossible. "You must have a keen eye for detail, Mrs. Vance," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "To notice the gardens in the dark, I mean. Did you see anything unusual out there? A shadow, perhaps, or someone moving about?" Mrs. Vance shook her head, her expression serene. "Nothing at all, I'm afraid. Just the stars and the scent of roses. I was quite lost in my thoughts." She paused, then added, "Of course, I did hear Mr. Drake arguing with the Colonel inside. Something about auctions, I think. He has such a temper, that man." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the comment. Drake's rivalry with the Colonel was no secret, but Mrs. Vance's mention of it felt deliberate, as if to shift attention. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a seamstress who deflected suspicion from her own theft by pointing fingers at a rival. She decided to probe further, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "It's curious, isn't it, how such a valuable stamp could vanish in a room full of people, almost as if someone planned it perfectly, knowing just when to act." Mrs. Vance's fan stopped, her eyes narrowing slightly before she laughed. "You have a vivid imagination, Miss Marple. I suppose it could be a professional thief, someone who slipped in unnoticed, though how they managed it with all of us there, I can't imagine." "Oh, I'm sure it was someone in the room," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Thieves are often closer than we think. Like that cameo in St. Mary Mead. The thief was a guest at the very tea party where it disappeared. She was so charming, no one thought to suspect her." Mrs. Vance's smile stiffened, and she rose, smoothing her skirt. "What a fascinating tale," she said, her voice a touch cooler. "I mustn't keep you from your walk, Miss Marple. I promised the Colonel I'd join him for luncheon. Will you be there?" "In a moment," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily. "I'll just finish this row." As Mrs. Vance glided away, her steps quick on the gravel, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the handkerchief she had left on the bench. It was exquisite, edged with lace. But what caught her attention was a faint, acrid scent. Chloroform, perhaps, or something similar. She tucked it into her knitting bag, her mind racing. Chloroform could be used to subdue a guard, though Hargreaves had shown no signs of being incapacitated. Still, it was a clue, one that suggested Mrs. Vance's stroll on the terrace might have been more than a quest for fresh air. Miss Marple rose, her gaze sweeping the gardens. The French doors, visible from the path, were a weak point in the manor's defences, easily opened from within. Mrs. Vance's vague alibi, her polished charm, her nervous gestures, all pointed to a woman with secrets. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Sloane's ink-stained hands, Drake's bitter rivalry, even the Colonel's pride, all were threads in the tapestry of the theft. The blue Mauritius, she was certain, was still close, hidden by a hand as deft as it was daring. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that charm could mask a multitude of sins, and Mrs. Vance's charm was a veil she intended to lift. Chapter 6. The Rival's Ambition. The late afternoon sun bathed Thornfield Manor in a warm amber glow, its rays slanting through the tall windows of the billiard room where Miss Jane Marple found herself observing Mr. Victor Drake. The rival collector, lean and sharp-featured, leaned over the green baize table, cue in hand, his movements precise, but charged with a restless energy. The room, with its dark wood panelling and heavy velvet curtains, carried an air of masculine retreat, though the tension from the previous night's theft lingered like a faint smoke. Miss Marple, seated in a leather armchair with her knitting bag at her side, had wandered in under the pretence of admiring the manor's decor, but her true purpose was to study Drake, whose barbed comments and smouldering rivalry with Colonel Rutherford had not escaped her notice. Drake was playing a solitary game, the clack of the billiard balls punctuating the silence. His dark eyes, hawk-like in their intensity, flicked toward Miss Marple as she settled into her seat, her needles clicking softly. "Miss Marple," he said, straightening with a half-smile that held more challenge than warmth, "come to try your hand at billiards? Or are you here to play detective?" "Oh, I'm far too clumsy for billiards, Mr. Drake," she replied, her voice mild and her smile disarming. "And as for detecting, I'm just an old woman with a fondness for puzzles." "This theft, though, it's quite a puzzle, don't you think? The blue Mauritius, vanishing under so many eyes." Drake's smile sharpened, and he leaned his cue against the table, crossing his arms. "A bold move, I'll give the thief that," he said, his tone carrying a hint of admiration. "Rutherford's so proud of that stamp, he practically invited someone to steal it, parading it like a trophy, bound to tempt someone." His eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple noted the edge in his voice, a bitterness that seemed to cut deeper than mere rivalry. She tilted her head, her needles moving steadily. "You and the Colonel have known each other some time, I gather. He mentioned you've crossed paths at auctions. It must be quite a thrill, competing for such rare prizes." Drake's laugh was short, almost a bark. "Thrill? More like warfare. Rutherford's got the money and the name, but I've got the nerve. I've outbid him more than once, though he'd never admit it. That blue Mauritius should have been mine. Would have been if he hadn't thrown his weight around at Sotheby's." He picked up his cue again, striking a ball with more force than necessary, sending it ricocheting off the cushion. "He loves lording it over the rest of us, you know. Keeps that stamp under glass like it's the crown jewels." Miss Marple's eyes followed the ball's path, but her mind was on Drake's words. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a gardener, Mr. Willis, whose envy of a neighbour's prize roses had led to a midnight act of sabotage. Envy, she had learned, could drive a man to desperate measures, and Drake's resentment of the Colonel was palpable. "It does seem a shame," she said, her tone sympathetic, "to have such a treasure locked away. You must have wanted to see it closely, to study it perhaps." Drake's cue paused, and he glanced at her, his expression wary. "Of course I did. Any collector would. But I didn't touch the case, if that's what you're getting at. I was with Rutherford most of the evening, arguing about his blasted collection. Ask him, he'll tell you." His voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the cue, the slight flush at his temples. "Arguing," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "Mrs. Vance mentioned hearing raised voices from the terrace. Something about auctions, I believe. It must have been quite a spirited discussion." Drake's eyes narrowed, but he recovered quickly, his smile returning. "Spirited, yes. Rutherford thinks he's the only one who knows value. I told him he's inflating the market, hoarding stamps like that Mauritius to drive up prices. It's not just collecting with him, it's power." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "If you ask me, someone got tired of his games and took what he didn't deserve to keep." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her face serene but her mind alert. Drake's accusation was bold, almost too bold, as if designed to deflect suspicion. She thought of the magnifying glass she had glimpsed in his coat pocket during dinner, a tool every collector carried, but one that could also be used to inspect a lock or a key. His familiarity with the manor, gained through years of visits, would have given him knowledge of its layout, its routines. Could he have slipped to the case during a moment of distraction? Perhaps when his argument with the Colonel drew all eyes? "It's a curious thing," she said, folding her knitting. How envy can twist one's perspective. In St. Mary Mead, there was a young man who coveted his friend's silver watch. He stole it during a card game, thinking no one would suspect him because he was so outspoken about his jealousy. But it was his very boldness that gave him away. Drake's smile faded, and he set the cue down, his movements deliberate. A quaint story, Miss Marple, but I'm no petty thief. I build my collection through skill, not stealth. If I wanted the Mauritius, I'd have bought it, not stolen it. He paused, then added, Besides, I'd wager Sloane knows more about moving stolen goods than I do. Dealers like him have contacts in places we don't talk about. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, though she filed away his attempt to shift blame. Sloane's ink-stained hands and nervous demeanour were indeed suspicious, but Drake's quickness to point fingers suggested he, too, had something to conceal. She thought of the wax smudge on the case, the French doors, the handkerchief with its faint whiff of chloroform. Drake's ambition, she mused, could have driven him to an act of daring, perhaps to prove a point to the Colonel or to claim a prize he felt was rightfully his. She rose, smoothing her shawl. "You're quite right, Mr. Drake," she said, her voice soft. "It's a matter of skill, isn't it? Whoever took the stamp was skilled indeed. I think I'll take a turn in the drawing room. Such a lovely space, though it's rather overshadowed now by that empty case." Drake watched her go, his eyes sharp, and Miss Marple felt his gaze like a prickle on her neck. As she stepped into the hall, her thoughts turned to the billiard room's proximity to the drawing room, just a short walk through a side corridor. Drake could have moved quickly, using his argument with the Colonel as a distraction. His magnifying glass, his knowledge of the manor, his burning resentment, all were pieces in the puzzle she was assembling. In the drawing room, she paused by the glass case, its emptiness a silent challenge. The wax smudge, still visible in the right light, nagged at her. It suggested a key had been copied, perhaps pressed into wax during a moment of inattention. Drake, with his bold manner, might have orchestrated such a move, but so could Sloane, or even Mrs. Vance. The Colonel's routines, so proudly described, were a map any of them could have followed. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the French doors, their latches gleaming. She thought of Drake's ambition, his need to outshine the Colonel. In St. Mary Mead, ambition had driven a young clerk to forge a will, thinking his audacity would shield him. Drake's audacity was clear, but whether it extended to theft remained to be seen. She tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind weaving the threads of envy, opportunity, and cunning. The blue Mauritius was close, she felt, hidden by a hand driven by motives as old as human nature itself. Chapter 7. The Clues. Unravel. The air in Thornfield Manor had grown heavy with suspicion by the second day, as if the very walls absorbed the unease of its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the distant view of the gardens through the tall windows. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the manor's ancient timbers and the soft tread of a maid passing through the hall. Inspector Crawley's investigation had yielded no breakthroughs, and the blue Mauritius remained as elusive as a shadow in a storm. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was beginning to see the faint outlines of a pattern, woven from the small details she had gathered like threads from a tangled skein. Inspector Crawley, his notebook now filled with pages of meticulous but fruitless notes, had spent the morning examining the drawing-room once more. He joined Miss Marple now, his ruddy face creased with frustration as he sank into a chair opposite her. "Not a single fingerprint, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his moustache. "The case is clean as a whistle. No scratches, no jimmy marks. The windows were latched, the French doors bolted, and Hargreaves swears no one slipped past him. It's as if the stamp vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked at him, with her mild, inquiring gaze. "It does seem remarkable, Inspector," she said softly, "but things don't vanish, you know. They're hidden, or moved, by someone who knows how to make it seem impossible. In St. Mary Mead, there was a case of a missing pearl necklace, taken from a locked drawer during a garden party. The thief used a moment of distraction, you see, and everyone was so busy looking elsewhere that no one noticed." Crawley's eyes narrowed, though a spark of interest flickered in them. "You've a knack for these stories, Miss Marple. But this isn't a necklace, it's a stamp, small enough to fit in a pocket and worth a fortune. Whoever took it had to know the case, the lock, the room." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "And that's what makes it so interesting. Whoever took it knew the Colonel's habits, his pride in that key, his hourly checks. It's someone who understood the rhythm of the evening." She paused, her eyes drifting to the drawing-room door, visible through the open archway. "Have you examined the case closely, Inspector? Every inch of it?" Crawley nodded, though his expression remained sceptical. "As close as I could without a magnifying glass. It's solid, Miss Marple. Lockhart and Sons don't make shoddy work. The Colonel's right, it's unpickable." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Unpickable, perhaps, but not unopenable. I noticed a smudge on the glass, Inspector, near the lock, a faint mark, like wax or oil. It might be nothing, but in St. Mary Mead, a smudge of grease on a window pane led us to a burglar who'd used a copied key." Crawley leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Wax, you say? I'll have another look. But the Colonel swears the key never left his pocket. You think someone made a copy?" "It's possible," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "A moment's access to the key, a handshake, a brush of hands, could be enough for a clever person to press it into wax. It's a trick I've heard of before, though not in St. Mary Mead, I confess." Crawley scribbled in his notebook, his moustache twitching with renewed purpose. "I'll check the smudge. Anything else catch your eye, Miss Marple?" She hesitated, her needles clicking as she considered her findings. There was the scrap of paper from Sloane's desk, with its list of stamp values and that curious circled S. There was Mrs. Vance's handkerchief, with its faint whiff of chloroform. A puzzling clue, as no one had been subdued. And there was Drake's magnifying glass, glimpsed in his pocket. A tool that could serve a thief as well as a collector. Each clue was small, but together they formed a tapestry of suspicion, each thread pointing to a different suspect. "There was a paper in the library," she said at last, choosing her words carefully. "A list of stamps and their values, in Mr. Sloane's handwriting. The blue Mauritius was on it, with a mark beside it. It might mean nothing, but a dealer like Mr. Sloane would know how to find a buyer, wouldn't he?" Crawley's eyes widened. "Sloane, eh? He's been slippery in his interviews, always talking about the market, but never quite answering straight. I'll have a word with him about this list." "And Mrs. Vance's handkerchief," Miss Marple added, her tone almost apologetic. "I found it in the garden, near where she said she walked. It has an odd smell, Chloroform, I think, though I'm no chemist. It's strange, don't you think, for a lady to carry such a thing? Chloroform? Crawley's pencil paused, his brow furrowing. That's a queer one. Hargreaves wasn't knocked out, and no one else reported feeling odd. Could be a mistake, but I'll have it tested. You're full of surprises, Miss Marple. Oh, I'm just observant, Inspector, she said, her smile disarming. And then there's Mr. Drake's magnifying glass. I saw it in his coat pocket at dinner. It's the sort of thing a collector uses, of course, but it could also help someone examine a lock or a key. Crawley leaned back, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. You've been busy, haven't you? 3 clues, 3 suspects. You're building a case, Miss Marple, whether you admit it or not. She shook her head, her needles clicking steadily. I'm only gathering threads, Inspector. The case is yours to build. But I do think these little things, the smudge, the paper, the handkerchief, the magnifying glass, are like the pieces of a quilt. They don't make sense alone, but together they tell a story. Crawley rose, tucking his notebook into his pocket. I'll look into all of it. The smudge first, then Sloane's paper, and that handkerchief. Drake's magnifying glass. Well, that's trickier, but I'll keep an eye on him. You've given me plenty to chew on, Miss Marple. As he left, his boots echoing in the hall, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the clues she had shared, and those she had kept to herself. The wax smudge suggested a copied key, but who had the opportunity to make it? Sloane, with his deft hands and dealer's knowledge, could have managed it during a moment of distraction. Mrs. Vance, with her charm and her terrace alibi, might have used her handkerchief for more than show. Drake, with his magnifying glass and his bold resentment, could have studied the lock during one of his visits to the manor. And yet, there was the Colonel himself, whose pride might have blinded him to a betrayal, or even prompted a scheme of his own. She thought of the French doors, so close to the case, and the butler's unwavering vigil at the main entrance. The room had been crowded, yet no one had seen the theft. It was, she mused, like the theft of a silver spoon in St. Mary Mead, taken from a tea tray, while the room buzzed with chatter. The thief had relied on misdirection, on the assumption that no one would notice a small act amid the noise. Here, too, the thief had counted on distraction, perhaps Sloane's conversation with Mrs. Vance, or Drake's argument with the Colonel. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way to the drawing-room. The glass case stood as it had, empty and mocking, its lock gleaming in the afternoon light. She bent closer, her eyes tracing the faint wax smudge, now more visible in the slanting rays. It was a clue, but not yet a solution. The paper, the handkerchief, the magnifying glass, each pointed to a suspect, but none told the whole story. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that clues were like stitches. Alone, they were nothing, but together they formed a pattern. She would keep watching, listening until the pattern was clear. As she left the drawing-room, the manor's clock chimed, its notes a reminder that time was moving forward, and the blue Mauritius was still out there, hidden by a hand as clever as it was bold. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The truth, she knew, was never far from those who looked for it. Chapter 8. The Village Parallel. The dining room of Thornfield Manor was a study in restrained elegance, its long mahogany table gleaming under the soft glow of a chandelier. The air carried the faint aroma of roasted lamb and rosemary, served for luncheon by a silent-footed Hargreaves, whose impassive demeanour belied the turmoil that had gripped the household since the theft of the Blue Mauritius. Miss Jane Marple sat at the table, her small figure almost lost among the high-backed chairs, her knitting bag tucked discreetly at her feet. Opposite her, Inspector Crawley picked at his meal, his notebook resting beside his plate, its pages now thick with scribbled observations. The other guests, Colonel Rutherford, Mr. Percival Sloane, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, and Mr. Victor Drake, ate in a tense silence, their glances darting like moths around a flame. Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face, broke the quiet with a gentle remark about the weather, a tactic she had honed in St. Mary Mead to ease strained gatherings. "Such a fine day," she said, her voice soft as the clink of her teacup. "It reminds me of a summer in my village, when we had a theft at the vicarage. A brooch, you know, taken during a tea party. It caused quite a stir." Inspector Crawley looked up, his fork pausing mid-air. "Another of your stories, Miss Marple," he said, a note of curiosity cutting through his weariness. "You've mentioned St. Mary Mead before. What happened with this brooch?" "Oh, it was a curious case," she replied, her needles clicking faintly as she drew them from her bag, though she kept them in her lap for now. "The brooch belonged to the vicar's wife, a lovely sapphire piece kept in a locked box. Everyone assumed a stranger had slipped in during the tea, but the truth was simpler and sadder. The thief was a friend someone trusted, who used the bustle of the party to cover their tracks. They'd planned it, you see, knowing exactly when eyes would be elsewhere." The Colonel, seated at the head of the table, set down his glass with a thud. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that one of my guests is the thief?" His voice was gruff, his moustache bristling with indignation. "I vetted them all. Sloane, Vance, Drake. They're people of standing." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Colonel. I'm only saying that people are much the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or a grand manor like this. Trust can blind us, you know. The vicar's wife never suspected her friend, 'cause she was so very charming." Mrs. Vance, seated to the Colonel's left, gave a light laugh, though her fan moved a touch faster. "What a quaint tale, Miss Marple! But surely a brooch is one thing, a stamp like the Blue Mauritius is quite another. It would take a master thief to pull off such a feat in a locked room." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes meeting Mrs. Vance's for a moment, before drifting to Sloane, who was cutting his lamb with exaggerated care. "But it's the planning that matters, isn't it? The thief knew the room, the lock, the moment. In St. Mary Mead, the friend knew the vicar's wife would be distracted by her duties as hostess. Here, someone knew the Colonel's habits, his key, his checks." Sloane's knife paused and he glanced up, his thin face composed but his eyes wary. "You're quite the storyteller, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth. "But I was with Mrs. Vance all evening, discussing stamps. I had no chance to tamper with the case." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as ever. "And yet the stamp is gone? It's curious, don't you think, how small things can be overlooked, like a smudge of wax, or a scrap of paper with prices written on it?" She did not look at Sloane as she spoke, but she felt his tension, like a taut string. Drake, lounging at the far end of the table, smirked, his dark eyes gleaming. "You're fishing, Miss Marple. If you've got clues, why not lay them out? Or are you just spinning village yarns to rattle us?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, her smile unwavering. "Oh, I'm not fishing, Mr. Drake. I'm only thinking aloud. In St. Mary Mead, we learned that the smallest clues, a glance, a hesitation, can tell a story. The brooch thief, you see, gave herself away by being too quick to point fingers at another guest." Drake's smirk faded, and he leaned back, his fingers drumming on the table. The Colonel, meanwhile, looked from Miss Marple to Crawley, his face reddening. "Inspector, have you found anything new? This talk of clues, wax paper, what's it all mean?" Crawley cleared his throat, his moustache twitching. "We're following leads, Colonel. The smudge, Miss Marple. Mentioned. Wax likely, near the lock. Could mean a key was copied, though we've no proof yet. And a paper in the library, with stamp values. We're looking into it." He glanced at Sloane, who stiffened, and Miss Marple noted the dealer's sudden interest in his plate, and the handkerchief she prompted gently. Her eyes on Mrs. Vance, who froze, her fan still for the first time. Crawley nodded, his voice cautious. "Sent it for testing. Odd smell, as you said. Could be chloroform, though what it means I'm not sure yet. No one was knocked out, far as we know." Mrs. Vance's laugh was brittle. "My handkerchief. Really, Inspector, it's just a bit of perfume. I must have dropped it in the garden. Surely you don't think I'd have anything to do with this?" "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "It's only a detail, Mrs. Vance, like Mr. Drake's magnifying glass, or Mr. Sloane's list. Small things, but they add up, don't they?" Drake's fingers stopped drumming, and Sloane's fork clattered against his plate. The Colonel's eyes darted between them, his pride warring with suspicion. Miss Marple, her knitting now in her hands, continued her work, her needles a quiet counterpoint to the rising tension. She thought of the wax smudge, suggesting a copied key, the list hinting at Sloane's plans, the handkerchief with its puzzling scent, and the magnifying glass, a tool for a collector or a thief. Each clue pointed to a suspect, but none completed the picture. Crawley pushed back his chair, his expression grim. "I'll need to speak with each of you again this afternoon. Miss Marple, you've a sharp eye. If you spot anything else, you'll let me know." "Of course, genius Inspector," she said, her voice as mild as the afternoon light. "I'm only here to help, you know." As the guests dispersed, their murmurs filling the hall, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the empty chair where the Colonel had sat. The village parallel, she thought, was striking. The brooch thief had relied on trust, on being above suspicion. Here, too, the thief had used familiarity, perhaps with the Colonel's key, perhaps with the manor's routines. Sloane's expertise, Vance's charm, Drake's ambition, all were threads in the tapestry, but the pattern was not yet clear. In St. Mary Mead, the truth had emerged from patience and observation, and Miss Marple was nothing if not patient. She tucked her knitting away, her mind weaving the clues into a story that was, she sensed, nearing its climax. Chapter 9. The Dealer's Slip. The village of St. Mary Mead, though miles away, seemed to linger in Miss Jane Marple's thoughts as she made her way to the post office, a quaint stone building nestled between the butcher's shop and the local inn. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled street, and the air carried the faint tang of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Miss Marple had suggested a walk to the post office to Mr. Percival Sloane, ostensibly to inquire about a stamp for her nephew's modest collection. But her true aim was to observe the dealer more closely. His ink-stained fingers, his nervous glances in the library, and the scrap of paper with its circled S had lodged in her mind like a stubborn knot in her knitting. She walked beside him now, her black lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, her steps slow but purposeful. Sloane, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, carried himself with the air of a man accustomed to commanding respect, though his eyes darted to the passing villagers as if expecting scrutiny. "A charming village, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with a restlessness that did not escape her notice. "I wouldn't have thought a place like St. Mary Mead would interest a woman of your perception." "Oh, it's full of surprises," she replied, her tone light and her smile disarming. "People are much the same everywhere, you know, whether in a village or a grand manor. They have their hopes, their fears, their little secrets. Like that theft I mentioned at luncheon, the brooch, taken by a trusted friend. It was her confidence, you see, that gave her away. She was too sure no one would suspect her." Sloane's smile was tight, and he adjusted his tie, a gesture Miss Marple noted as one of discomfort. "You do love your stories," he said, his laugh a touch too hearty. "But I assure you, I'm no thief. My business is in buying and selling, not stealing. The blue Mauritius would be a devil to move anyway. Too recognizable. Only a fool would try." They reached the post office, its door jingling as they entered. The clerk, a bespectacled woman with a brisk manner, greeted Miss Marple warmly, accustomed to her occasional visits. Miss Marple approached the counter, her voice bright as she inquired about a penny stamp for her nephew. "Something simple, you understand," she said, "but perhaps a bit special. He's only just started collecting, but he's so keen." As the clerk rummaged through a drawer, Miss Marple turned to Sloane, her eyes bright with feigned ignorance. "You must know all about stamps, Mr. Sloane. What would you recommend for a beginner? Something affordable, but with a story behind it." Sloane, clearly relieved to be on familiar ground, leaned against the counter, his posture relaxing. "For a beginner, I'd suggest a Victorian issue, perhaps a penny red. Common enough, but with varieties that teach you to look closely. Plate numbers, perforations. It's how I started, you know, years ago. Every stamp has a tale, Miss Marple. Take the Mauritius. It's not just paper. It's a mistake, a printer's error that became a legend." His enthusiasm was genuine, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something else. A hint of calculation, perhaps, as he spoke of the Mauritius. The guy nodded, encouraging him to continue. "A legend indeed. It must be tempting for a dealer to handle such a stamp, even if it's not quite legal. I imagine there are buyers who don't ask too many questions." Sloane's eyes narrowed, but he recovered quickly, his smile returning. "Oh, there are always buyers, Miss Marple, but I deal in the open market. Too risky otherwise. Just last month, I sold a Mauritius, not the blue Mauritius, mind you, but a fine example, to a private collector in Paris. Paid handsomely, no questions asked." He laughed, but the sound was forced, and Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, paused as she registered his slip. "A Mauritius, you say?" she asked, her voice as innocent as a child's. "How fascinating! I thought the blue Mauritius was one of only 12. Are there others, then, that fetch such prices?" Sloane's face paled, and he cleared his throat, his fingers tugging at his cuff. "A slip of the tongue," he said quickly. "I meant a post office Mauritius, a later issue, not the blue. Common enough in certain circles, though still valuable. Nothing like the Colonel's prize, of course." He turned to the clerk, asking for a sheet of stamps to inspect, his movements brisk, as if to change the subject. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. The slip was small, but telling. Sloane had spoken of selling a Mauritius, and his hasty correction suggested he had revealed more than he intended. She thought of the scrap of paper in the library, with its list of stamp values and the circled S. Could it stand for Sloane himself, marking a plan to sell the stolen blue Mauritius? In St. Mary Mead, a grocer had once let slip a detail about a stolen crate of apples, betrayed by his own eagerness to boast. Sloane's expertise, his access to buyers, and now this slip made him a figure of keen interest. The clerk handed Miss Marple a small envelope with a penny red, and she thanked her warmly, tucking it into her knitting bag. As they stepped back into the street, Sloane seemed eager to part ways, citing a need to return to the manor for the inspector's next round of interviews. "I'll walk back with you if I may," Miss Marple said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. "The village is so peaceful, but I do enjoy company." Sloane nodded, though his expression was strained. As they walked, Miss Marple kept the conversation light, speaking of the village's history and its quiet charm. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the clues. The wax smudge on the case, suggesting a copied key, the handkerchief with its chloroform scent, hinting at Mrs. Vance's involvement, Drake's magnifying glass, a tool for a collector or a thief, and now Sloane's slip, pointing to a possible plan to sell the stamp. Each clue was a thread, and Sloane's thread was growing thicker. She thought of the Colonel's key, always on his person, and the moment it might have been accessed. A handshake, a distraction, Sloane, with his deft hands, could have pressed the key into wax during a casual exchange. His ink-stained cuffs, she noted, were still visible, a sign of work with small tools, perhaps even a mould for a key. In St. Mary Mead, a watchmaker had once forged a key to steal a rival's designs, his hands similarly marked by his trade. As they neared the manor, Sloane's pace quickened, and Miss Marple let him pull ahead, her eyes on his retreating figure. His slip about the Mauritius was a crack in his polished facade, and she intended to widen it. The blue Mauritius, she was certain, was not far, hidden perhaps in a catalogue or a pocket, waiting for a buyer who asked no questions. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the truth often lay in what was said carelessly, and Sloane's careless words had given her a new thread to follow. She adjusted her shawl, her mind as sharp as the needles in her bag, ready to unravel the next piece of the puzzle. Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The evening shadows lengthened across Thornfield Manor's drawing room, where the air held a taut expectancy, as if the very walls anticipated a revelation. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking with their steady rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the murmurs of the assembled guests. The Colonel, Mr. Sloane, Mrs. Vance, and Mr. Drake were present, their faces a study in guarded unease, each aware that Inspector Crawley's investigation had yet to yield the blue Mauritius. Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, had devised a plan to stir the waters, and with the inspector's reluctant agreement, the stage was set for a subtle trap. The idea had come to her during her walk back from the village post office, Sloane's slip about the Mauritius still echoing in her mind. A thief, she knew from her St. Mary Mead days, often betrayed themselves when tempted by opportunity. So, at her suggestion, Colonel Rutherford had announced that a second rare stamp, a red mercury, would be displayed in the same glass case that evening. A fiction, of course, but one designed to lure the thief into action. The Colonel, though sceptical, had agreed, his pride bruised, but his trust in Miss Marple's instincts growing. Inspector Crawley, stationed discreetly in the hall, was ready to watch, his notebook at the ready. The drawing-room was arranged much as it had been the night of the theft, with the glass case once again the centrepiece, now containing a carefully chosen substitute stamp, a convincing replica provided by Sloane himself, who had been persuaded to assist in the ruse, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The French doors stood slightly ajar, their latches gleaming, and Hargreaves the butler maintained his vigil by the main entrance, his face as impassive as ever. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, observed the guests with the patience of a gardener waiting for a bud to bloom. Colonel Rutherford, standing by the fireplace, cleared his throat, his voice carrying the authority of a man reclaiming control. "My friends," he said, his moustache quivering, "despite our recent misfortune, I've decided to share another treasure from my collection. The red mercury, a stamp of rare beauty. I trust we'll have no further incidents." His eyes swept the room, lingering on each guest, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, the way his hand rested protectively on the key in his waistcoat pocket. Mrs. Vance, seated on a velvet settee, fanned herself with her usual grace, her emerald eyes sparkling with curiosity. "How brave of you, Colonel," she said, her voice like a melody. "After such a loss, to display another treasure, it's quite inspiring." Her smile was radiant, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her fingers on the fan, a sign of nerves that echoed the faint chloroform scent of her handkerchief. Sloane, standing near the case, adjusted his tie, his ink-stained fingers betraying a restless energy. "A fine choice, Colonel," he said, his tone smooth, but his eyes fixed on the glass. "The red mercury is a collector's dream. I trust your precautions are even tighter this time." His question was casual, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze lingered on the lock, as if measuring its strength. Drake, leaning against a window, smirked, his dark eyes glinting with mockery. "Bold move, Rutherford," he said, his voice laced with challenge. "But aren't you tempting fate? Another stamp, another chance for someone to prove they're cleverer than you." He glanced at the case, then at the Colonel, his posture relaxed, but his fingers drumming lightly on the sill. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her face serene, but her mind alert. The trap was simple. The red mercury was a lure, and the thief, if tempted, might reveal themselves by approaching the case. She had shared her clues with Crawley, the wax smudge, Sloane's list, Vance's handkerchief, Drake's magnifying glass, but kept her suspicions fluid, knowing the truth lay in action, not assumption. In St. Mary Mead, a similar trap had caught a thief who couldn't resist a second helping of stolen silver, betrayed by their own greed. As the evening progressed, the guests mingled, their conversation stilted but polite. Sloane hovered near the case, his fingers brushing the glass as he admired the replica stamp, his movements slow and deliberate. Miss Marple watched him closely, recalling his slip about the Mauritius and the circled S on his list. Could he be planning to repeat his trick, believing the red mercury was real? His expertise made him the likeliest to bypass the lock, perhaps with a copied key. Mrs. Vance, meanwhile, excused herself for a moment, citing a need for fresh air. She stepped toward the French doors, her silk skirt rustling, and Miss Marple's eyes followed her. The terrace, where she claimed to have wandered during the theft, was a perfect vantage point or a perfect escape. The chloroform-scented handkerchief, still in Miss Marple's bag, suggested a deeper role, perhaps as a distraction or an accomplice. As Mrs. Vance lingered by the doors, her fan fluttering, a sudden telephone ring echoed from the hall, and she started, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. Drake, too, was restless, his argument with the Colonel resuming in low tones near the fireplace. "You're playing a dangerous game, Rutherford," he said, his voice sharp. "This stamp won't stay safe any more than the last one did." The Colonel's face reddened, but before he could reply, Drake moved toward the case, his hand slipping into his pocket, where Miss Marple knew the magnifying glass lay. Was he planning to inspect the lock, or something more? As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple slipped from her chair, her small figure moving silently to an alcove near the French doors, where a heavy curtain offered concealment. She had chosen this spot with care, her view of the case unobstructed. The room buzzed with tension, and she felt the moment approaching, like the pause before a storm. Her needles were still, her breath slow, her eyes fixed on the scene. Sloane lingered by the case, his fingers grazing the lock as if testing its weight. Mrs. Vance returned from the terrace, her cheeks flushed, her eyes darting to the telephone in the hall, which had gone silent. Drake, now near the Colonel, kept his hand in his pocket, his posture casual, but his gaze sharp. Then, as the Colonel turned to answer a question from Hargreaves, a shadow moved, a swift, deliberate motion near the case. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her eyes missing nothing. The shadow was Sloane, his hand slipping something small, a tool perhaps, back into his sleeve as he stepped away. The case remained closed, the replica stamp untouched, but Miss Marple saw the faint glint of wax on his cuff, a mirror of the smudge on the case. Mrs. Vance, meanwhile, had positioned herself near the French doors, her fan shielding her face as she glanced at Sloane. Drake's eyes followed them both, his magnifying glass now in his hand, held low as if to conceal it. Miss Marple stepped from the alcove, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, I believe you might want to check the case now." Crawley, alerted by her signal, emerged from the hall, his boots loud on the parquet floor. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of surprise and suspicion. "Check it," the Colonel blustered. "It's locked, Miss Marple. I've the key right here." But Crawley, guided by Miss Marple's nod, approached the case, his eyes narrowing at the lock. "There's another smudge," he said, his voice grim. "Wax just like before. Mr. Sloane, step away from the case, please." Sloane's face paled, but he complied, his hands raised in protest. "This is absurd," he said, his voice strained. "I was only admiring the stamp." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "Admiring, perhaps," she said, "but in St. Mary Mead we learned that admiration can sometimes be a mask. The thief who took the vicar's brooch was caught when she tried to steal again, thinking herself safe." She turned to Crawley, her voice steady. "You might check Mr. Sloane's sleeve, Inspector, and perhaps ask Mrs. Vance about that telephone call." The trap had been sprung, and though the Red Mercury was safe, the night had revealed more than the thief had intended. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, her mind weaving the final threads of the pattern she had seen forming since the theft. Chapter 11. The Revelation. The drawing-room of Thornfield Manor was bathed in the soft glow of morning light, its heavy curtains drawn back to reveal the gardens beyond, their roses now tinged with the first hints of autumn. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her small figure a quiet anchor amid the tension that crackled like static among the assembled guests. Colonel Rutherford, Mr. Percival Sloane, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, and Mr. Victor Drake sat in a semicircle, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity, while Inspector Crawley stood by the glass case, his notebook tucked under his arm. The empty case, once home to the Blue Mauritius, stood as a silent witness to the drama about to unfold. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, had requested this gathering, her voice gentle but firm, and the Colonel, though sceptical, had agreed, sensing her quiet authority. "Miss Marple," the Colonel said, his moustache bristling as he leaned forward in his chair, "you've something to tell us, I presume. The inspector says you've been observant. I hope you've more than village stories this time." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face. "Oh, I'm only an old woman, Colonel," she said, her voice soft as the rustle of leaves outside. "But I've learned that human nature is much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or here at Thornfield. Greed, envy, charm, they lead people to act in predictable ways, if you know where to look. The theft of your stamp, you see, was not so different from a theft I recall. A silver candlestick, taken from a church altar during a crowded service. The thief relied on trust, on being above suspicion." Inspector Crawley cleared his throat, his ruddy face expectant. "Let's have it, Miss Marple. You've pointed us to clues, wax, a handkerchief, a list, a magnifying glass. What's the story they tell?" Miss Marple folded her hands, her gaze steady. "It begins with a simple truth," she said. "The Blue Mauritius was taken by someone who knew the manner, the case, and the Colonel's habits. The lock was unmarred, the key never left his pocket, yet the stamp vanished. That suggests cunning, not force. In St. Mary Mead, the candlestick thief used a moment of distraction, a hymn when all eyes were on the hymnals. Here, too, the thief used distraction, knowing when attention would wander." She turned to the Colonel, her voice gentle but probing. "Your key, Colonel, was the heart of it. You checked the case hourly, a routine you're proud of. But routines can be exploited. A clever person could predict your movements, perhaps even gain access to the key for a moment." The Colonel's face reddened, his hand patting the key in his waistcoat. "Impossible! The key never left me, Miss Marple. I'd have felt it." "Would you?" she asked, her tone mild. "A handshake, a brush of hands, such a small moment could be enough. I noticed a smudge of wax on the case, you see, near the lock. It suggests someone made an impression of your key, perhaps during a casual exchange." Her eyes moved to Sloane, whose thin face had grown pale, his ink-stained fingers twitching in his lap. Sloane shifted, his voice sharp. "This is nonsense! I was with Mrs. Vance all evening, nowhere near the case. You've no proof, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's smile did not waver. "Proof comes in small things, Mr. Sloane. Like the scrap of paper I found in the library, in your handwriting, listing the Blue Mauritius with a circled S. Or your slip at the post office, when you spoke of selling a Mauritius to a private buyer. A mistake, you said, but it was telling. In St. Mary Mead, a grocer once betrayed himself by boasting of a sale he shouldn't have made. Sloane's eyes darted to the door, but Crawley stepped forward, his presence a quiet warning. "Go on, Miss Marple," the inspector said, his moustache twitching with interest. She turned to Mrs. Vance, whose fan was still, her emerald eyes wide. "Mrs. Vance, your charm is undeniable, but charm can be a mask. Your handkerchief, left in the garden, carried a scent of chloroform. Odd for a lady's accessory. And your alibi, a stroll on the terrace, places you near the French doors, so close to the case. Were you distracting the room, perhaps, with your conversation with Mr. Sloane?" Mrs. Vance's laugh was brittle, her fan snapping open. "Really, Miss Marple, this is absurd. Chloroform. It's perfume, nothing more. And I was alone on the terrace, as I told the inspector." "Alone, yes," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unrelenting. "But the French doors were unlatched, easily opened from within. A quick step, a moment's distraction. Someone could have acted swiftly." Her gaze shifted to Drake, whose smirk had faded, his dark eyes wary. "And you, Mr. Drake, with your magnifying glass and your rivalry with the Colonel. Your argument with him that night drew eyes, didn't it? A perfect moment for a thief to act. Your familiarity with the manor, your ambition to outshine the Colonel, both could have driven you to take the stamp." Drake leaned back, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "You're spinning a fine tale, Miss Marple, but I'm no thief. I'd buy what I want, not steal it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Perhaps, but the truth lies in the pattern. Last night, when we displayed the red mercury, I watched. Mr. Sloane, you lingered by the case, your hand brushing the lock, leaving another smudge of wax. Mrs. Vance, you were near the French doors, startled by a telephone call that never came. Mr. Drake, your magnifying glass was in your hand, as if ready to inspect or to act. But only one of you had the means, the motive, and the opportunity." She turned to Sloane, her voice steady. "Mr. Sloane, you're a dealer, with knowledge of locks and markets. You knew the blue Mauritius's value, and your list suggested a plan to sell it. The wax smudge points to a copied key, made during a moment when you shook the Colonel's hand, perhaps, or brushed against him. The stamp was hidden, I believe, in your catalogue, a hollowed-out page easy to overlook." Sloane's face drained of colour, his hands gripping the chair. "This is preposterous. You've no evidence." Crawley stepped forward, holding up a thick catalogue, its pages fanned open to reveal a small, hidden compartment. "We found this in your room, Mr. Sloane," he said, his voice grim. "And inside, the blue Mauritius, just as Miss Marple suggested." The room gasped, the Colonel's face a mask of fury. Sloane stammered, his composure crumbling. I was holding it for a client. I didn't steal it." Miss Marple shook her head, her needles still in her lap. In St. Mary Mead, the candlestick thief said much the same. But greed, Mr. Sloane, is a simple motive. You saw a fortune and acted, trusting your skill to hide it. Mrs. Vance's fan fell to her lap, her eyes wide with relief or guilt. Miss Marple could not yet tell. Drake's smirk returned, though it was tinged with unease. The Colonel rose, his voice trembling. "Sloane, you blackguard, under my roof!" Crawley placed a hand on Sloane's shoulder, his tone firm. "You'll come with me, sir. We've questions to answer." As Sloane was led away, still protesting, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the case. The pattern was complete. the threads woven into a truth as clear as the morning light. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the simplest motives, greed, envy, pride, were often the key, and here, too, they had unlocked the mystery. Chapter 12. The Aftermath. The morning mist clung to the lawns of Thornfield Manor, softening the edges of its Georgian facade as Miss Jane Marple stood on the gravel drive, her small suitcase at her feet. The station cab would arrive soon to take her back to St. Mary Mead, but for now she lingered, her black lace shawl drawn about her shoulders, her knitting bag a familiar weight in her hand. The manor, so recently a stage for suspicion and deceit, seemed to exhale a quiet relief, its windows catching the first rays of sunlight. The blue Mauritius had been recovered. Mr. Percival Sloane was in custody, and the air of tension that had gripped the household was beginning to dissipate. Yet Miss Marple, her pale blue eyes sharp as ever, knew that the ripples of such an event would linger, like the echoes of a village scandal. Inside, the drawing-room was empty now, the glass case returned to its rosewood table, the blue Mauritius once again under lock and key. Colonel Rutherford, his pride restored but his trust shaken, had spent the morning in his study, drafting letters to his fellow philatelists to reassure them of his collection's security. He emerged now, his military bearing intact, though his face carried the weight of betrayal. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff as he approached her, "I owe you a debt I can't repay. You've saved my reputation and my stamp." "Oh, it was nothing, Colonel," she replied, her smile gentle but her tone firm. "I only saw what was there to see. People, you know, are much the same everywhere. In St. Mary Mead, we had a theft once, a silver teapot, taken by a trusted guest. It's the trust that blinds us, isn't it? But a little observation, a little patience, and the truth comes clear." The Colonel's moustache twitched, and he clasped her hand, his grip warm and earnest. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'll not forget this. If you're ever in need of a friend or a stamp for that nephew of yours, Thornfield is open to you." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "You're very kind, Colonel, but I think my nephew's collection will stay modest. Stamps are such small things, but they do stir such passions, don't they?" As the Colonel returned to the manor, Mrs. Eleanor Vance appeared, her elegant figure framed by the doorway. Her emerald eyes, no longer guarded, held a flicker of gratitude, though Miss Marple sensed a lingering unease. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice softer than its usual melodic chime, "I must thank you. That dreadful business with the handkerchief. I feared you suspected me." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her gaze was steady. "Oh, I only wondered, Mrs. Vance. The chloroform was puzzling, I admit, but it was likely a red herring, wasn't it? A touch of perfume, perhaps, or a chemical from the garden. In St. Mary Mead, we once mistook a gardener's liniment for poison. But I did wonder about your debts, you know. Charm can hide so much." Mrs. Vance's fan paused, her lips parting in surprise before she laughed, a sound tinged with relief. "You're too sharp, Miss Marple. Yes, I've had financial troubles since Charles died. I came to Thornfield hoping to learn about stamps, perhaps to sell some trinkets of my own. But steal? Never." She hesitated, then added, "I'm grateful you saw the truth." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking faintly as she drew them from her bag. "The truth is often simple, Mrs. Vance. It's the masks we wear that complicate things." As Mrs. Vance retreated, Mr. Victor Drake emerged, his lean frame slouched but his dark eyes less hostile than before. He stopped before Miss Marple, his hands in his pockets, the magnifying glass no doubt tucked away. "You had me worried, Miss Marple," he said, his smirk faint but genuine. "Thought you'd pin it on me, with my big talk and that magnifying glass. I'll admit, I wanted that stamp, wanted to rub Rutherford's nose in it, but I'm no thief." "No, Mr. Drake," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're a rival, not a criminal. Envy can lead to rash words, but not always to rash deeds. In St. Mary Mead, a young man envied his neighbour's prize roses and spoke of ruining them, but it was another who wielded the shears. I'm glad you've seen the folly of such rivalry." Drake's smirk softened, and he nodded, almost sheepish. "I'll keep that in mind, Miss Marple. Maybe I'll stick to auctions from now on." As he walked away, the station cab rattled up the drive, its driver tipping his cap. Miss Marple climbed in, her suitcase stowed beside her, and as the manner receded, she reflected on the case. Sloane's greed, masked by his polished demeanour, had led him to copy the Colonel's key, using a wax impression made during a handshake, a trick he'd likely learned in his trade. The stamp, hidden in a hollowed-out catalogue, was meant for a buyer who asked no questions, a plan betrayed by his own slip at the post office and the wax smudge on his cuff. Mrs. Vance's charm and Drake's ambition had been distractions. Their clues, chloroform, magnifying glass, mere threads that led elsewhere. The cab rolled through St. Mary Mead's familiar lanes, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to home. The village, with its quiet scandals and hidden truths, had taught her to see through the masks people wore. Here at Thornfield, greed had been the key, as simple and timeless as the motives she'd uncovered in her own corner of the world. She adjusted her shawl, her needles clicking softly, already anticipating the next puzzle that might cross her path, for Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew her own village, that human nature would always provide another mystery to unravel.